Hi, this is Bob Sorrentino with Italian Roots and Genealogy, and I'm here with Paula Zichinchi-Manning, and we're going to talk a little bit about her research and her family. So, welcome, Paula. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I always start with, what got you the bug? Why did you start? When did you start?
Unfortunately, the reason that I started was that my mom passed away, and this was actually kind of her thing that she got into. And I was young, I was in my 20s. And when she passed away, she asked me to finish it for her. So, very sentimental reasons. So I started, and back then in 1996, there was not a lot of resources available other than the family history centers. There was not a lot on the internet. So I would make my way to the family history centers. I would make my way to the archives in New York City. Fortunately, we had a lot of resources for Italian genealogy in the area that I'm from. So that's how I started.
Yeah, and that's something. I mean, I started. I guess it's probably about 15 years now, or something like that. So the internet was there, and I've done some interviews with Family Search, but I didn't realize that they had those centers open back that far long ago. That they were already filming.
Yes, we had two big centers within 20 minutes of each other that I used to go to. And once I got started, she had very minimal information. She had taken like a class at the library, and she had very minimal information. She tried communicating with letters back and forth with Italy, but that did not prove fruitful. So I just had really only the information of my family here. And so then I had to kind of start from there. And then the bug bit me, and that was it.
I know that's what happens to all of us. My family thinks I'm crazy.
Some of them, all my family members, she was always kind of like the keeper of the family history. She had all the old photos. She had all of like the family names and the birth certificates and the death certificates. And, every time there was like a new baby, somebody would call her and be like, okay, go through the names with me so that they could kind of pick a family name. So she had all of that stuff, and she kept all of it. And so now I have it all. And so I just kind of started from there. And so now they call me when they need a baby name.
So now they're looking for baby names within the family history, or they're just looking for Italian names.
Some of them are looking for, within the family history. Most of them are not Italian names, or there's some derivative of an Italian name. So, we have a lot of, so my great great grandmother in Italy, her name was Carolina. And so there's a lot of derivatives of that. There's, my mother was a Carolyn, there's two Carls, there's a Carmela, there's a Carla. So there's lots of derivatives of family names. They just kind of, hear the name that they like and then maybe come up with something like a little different. Some people are very into the stories that I have to tell. Some of them are like, yeah, why am I listening to you?
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, that's funny. My mom's name was Caroline,
Oh,
and
okay.
I never really associated that with Italian until I started doing the research and realized that Carolina is a big Italian name. Uh,
Right.
and I haven't found anybody, Carolina in my mom's family. And actually, her name was supposed to be Raquel Carolina. And my grandmother had a fight with her sister-in-law. Uh, and so she changed it from Carolina to Carolina Raquel.
Okay.
So she still left it, but she
Right.
got second place instead of first
Right.
place. uh, so now I'm guessing both your parents were Italian, yes?
Well, yes. Both my grandfathers were Italian.
Grandfathers.
Both my grandfathers. My grandmother's long, rich American history back to the 1600s, but both my grandfathers were Italian. My one grandfather on my father's side was born in Italy. He came over when he was about three in 1909. So I was not able to pursue citizenship through him because his father had naturalized by the time he was, he was still a child. So,
Mhm.
And then my mother's family, so they're from Sicily, Trapani. And then my mother's family is from right outside of Naples, Castellamare di Stabia, right there on the beginning of the, Amalfi Coast.
Yep.
And a little bit further out in Monturo, which it's now one, it used to be two towns and they combined them. There were two Monturo towns, so they combined them. And so then my mother's family's from there too as well.
Yeah, well,
So
my father's.
we have Montori, we have Buonato, we have Zichinchi, lots of Italian names going on there.
Yeah, my dad's family's from Naples, and my mom's from Bari. So, when they used to speak to each other, they always trying to tell the other one that you're not speaking the right Italian, because they had two different dialects. So
Right.
now that's interesting that you have both grandfathers married American women. That's pretty unusual back then.
Well, actually, my great grandmother was actually born here. So her, on my mother's side, they came over in 1892. And so my great grandmother was born here in Paterson, and she was an American citizen. However, she got kind of caught up in that quirky law in the early 1900s, where if you married an immigrant, you were stripped of your citizenship.
No, I didn't know that. I never
Yes.
knew that.
So there's a period between, I think, 1907 and 1923, maybe 1913. I forget. It was a very brief period of time. It's when they started to put quotas in, I believe. And so she was actually, they were married in 1911. She married an Italian immigrant, and yeah, she was stripped of her citizenship. And she
That's
became
wild.
Italian. She had to take the citizenship of her husband.
That's nuts.
Yeah, that's what happened. And
Now,
then
did she have to apply to get it back?
they called it repatriation. It wasn't, where she would apply for citizenship. Once he became a citizen, then she could repatriate.
That's insane.
So it's very weird. It's like I
Very
stumbled
strange.
upon this article and I was kind of shocked. I was like, oh my, I said, I wonder if she even knew that. I wonder if she even was aware that that was happening at the time, because that was just like the 1911, and they were a very traditional Italian family, and they spoke Italian, and her husband spoke Italian. So I'm not sure how much they were paying attention to what was going on, but I haven't been able to find records.
Yeah, see, my wife's case, her dad was actually he was born in Dominican Republic, but then he lived in Puerto Rico.
Okay.
But his father was his father was born in Puerto Rico, but because he was born before 1898, he was not considered an American citizen.
Okay.
So her grandfather was not considered an American citizen because he was considered a Spanish citizen, and her father didn't get American citizenship because his father wasn't, and he was born in Dominican Republic. So he eventually had to, you take the test and do all of that kind of stuff. So the Italian. So what have you found out about these, the Italian families that's interesting?
Right. So I knew, all of these people, my great grandparents, I knew them well. And so I did whatever I could do here. And I would do it for like 6 months, and then I'd kind of back off of it for a little while because I had like gone through all of the records that I could possibly find. And then you kind of have to sit back and wait for new things to develop or new records to come online, new passenger ships. I had a very difficult time finding him coming over, my great grandfather, because they spelled his name phonetically the way he said it, which made it very difficult for me to find him. So it wasn't until I went down to the courthouse, because I guess in New Jersey, they did everything on a county level. That it was not a national process, and they don't keep the records at NARA for Jerseyans who applied for citizenship. It's all on a county level. So once I went down to the county and I found his naturalization papers or his intention, and that was early on. So I was actually allowed to go into the room with the big books that, really large books with all of these old papers, and they made me put the gloves on, and so this was probably like mid 90s, I would say. Now you can't get near any of the records. They don't allow that anymore. But so that was a nice experience when I did that. And so then I found out the ship that he came in on, and then he went into the city, and from there I kind of had to back into his record. So I did most everything that I could do here. I gathered some birth certificates from the Family History Center, but I really couldn't do much more until I went to Italy. So a few years back, we decided to go. I hired a driver. We went out into the, countryside, and I was very moved by the whole experience, because to see these journeys that your relatives took, for me, it was an hour to just, drive out in this, beautifully air conditioned Mercedes van with my translator. But I can't imagine it was all that easy back in the early 1900s. Because that's when he came over in the 1909, 1906. So I went back, and I went to the courthouse there, the clerk's office, and, they let me in to touch all their records and books too, which was a nice feeling. And, they went through everything with me. And some of it was a little bit choppy because we had the translator, but that couldn't have been lovelier. And then once they found out Carolina Trifone, once they found out that name, they had to call the police chief down. So the police chief came down to the office, and that was his last name. So like, he was very excited. And, and then they sent me over to the churches, and there were these elderly gentlemen sitting out in the courtyard of the church drinking their wine. And so then I was like talking to them, and they are just a wealth of information, like sometimes better than some of the records. So that was fascinating. So, but it wasn't until my second trip back that then we started to piece a lot more together. And so my great grandfather had always said that he had two sisters. And I have a picture of my 2 times great grandfather and these 2 women who were supposedly his sisters. And so I was like, okay, fine. So I was looking for their records, but the records kind of weren't jiving. And then all of a sudden out pops this third sister. And I was like, oh, he had a third sister who lived well into her 90s in 1960 something. Like, how did no one in the family, not even one of my aunts, she's 96, and it's his daughter, how did she not even know? He never spoke about it. He came over, there was never any discussion about, the motherland and the homeland. There was none of that. So there weren't a lot of stories, which I think is probably the reason that my mother, kind of ventured into it, and then I took it over. And so then, as I was going back and piecing all the records together, unfortunately, you could see the sadness and the, kind of the trauma that they suffered, with, early mortality. And, I have a feeling he probably didn't discuss it because it was really quite sad. He had a sister who died when she was 7. I can't imagine him being 10 watching that. Was, how sad is that? And, and then he had, so then we determined there were the 2 sisters that were left were the 2 sisters he was referring to. So he never really spoke about that third sister. And then mom, she just kind of disappeared from the records. I can't find her anywhere. So I'm not sure, what happened. Something happened, in the early 20s. A lot of this stuff you kind of have to piece together by dates. So you have to look at the date of death, and then you look at some of these certificates, and they'll tell you, was he widowed, and, or was he married at the time? And so it was fascinating that we found this extra sister. And we did that on the second trip back because I went and sat at the church with the priest. And, people can't, if you have genealogy that you want to do, and you're over there, they're more than happy to help you. And they're very excited when you come. They roll out the red carpet for you. You're welcome. And I was like, I can't believe people, I figured they would think, oh, well, your family left, we're not going to bother with you. But no, they're very happy, and they're very excited, and they want to know, I have a cousin in Wisconsin. Do you know this name? And I'm thinking New Jersey is nowhere near Wisconsin, because they have I don't want to say they don't have any concept of it, but they don't. It's just like, oh, well, you must know Italians in Wisconsin. So, but they're like, I said, how come you're so happy, that we're here and everybody rolls out the red carpet? And they're like, we're just so grateful because we know that all these family members left, and we're happy to see somebody come back, because we know they made it, did what their goal was when they left. So that was an interesting, and then my aunt, who's still alive, she was under the impression that she got her name from one of these sisters. And after going through all of the records, on my great grandmother's side, it became clear. I found two other missing sisters, and now I've recently made contact with their descendants and gotten together with them. So you just kind of never know where you're going to find a sibling
Yeah.
or an
Yeah.
aunt or an uncle. And so then I had to tell her that her name was not where she thought she got it from. I was like, no, you got your name from this other sister who passed away right before you were born. So there's like all these kind of stories, like, because if you follow the naming convention, that's kind of how it works. So I'm in the process now of doing a little bit more research on on my grandfather, on my father's side, because when we went back to that community, they actually took us to the house that he was born in, and it was like boarded up. And so we had this real estate agent there, and they're like, well, the house is probably yours. It hasn't been lived in since like the 1930s.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Right. And he's like, that's the last time anybody was in this house. Like, it's that dilapidated. He's like, and you can tell, and he's explaining to me the different types of architecture and the different types of things that would have happened over the years if someone was actually living there. And so that grandfather on my father's side, he had gone back in the 30s, and they went back frequently, that side of the family. And unfortunately, when he was there, his wife passed away, but she passed away in Tunisia. So all this time I was looking for her death certificate, like, oh, they went back to Italy and she died over in Italy, and, whatever. And I'm like, okay. And so I'm looking for the documents. I couldn't find anything. And then finally somebody said, well, maybe she might've been in Tunisia. And I was like, okay, well, they went back and forth to work there. That was, I guess, their means. And so then I started looking in like Tunisian records, and I couldn't find anything. And I was just like, why can't I find any records? And so then finally, a light bulb went off in my head. I had to go to the French embassy to get her records, because at the time that she died, it was the French colony.
Oh, right. Sure.
So all of her death certificate and all of those records at that time are in French, which
Wow,
was
that's something.
kind of
Yeah.
surprising to me. I didn't, anticipate finding that. But anyway, so she died when they were over there, and he probably just left and came home.
Yeah.
So
Well,
now,
I guess back then, what else could you do, right? I mean,
right. Yeah. I was kind of shocked by the whole thing. I was like, wow. And so like the stories that you find are fascinating. The people that you meet are fascinating. I hired a driver when we were in Sicily, and I said, I want to go to this little specific town. And he's like, why do you want to go to that town? And, so I told him, I said, that's where my grandfather was born and my great grandparents and so forth. And he's like, oh, well, that's where I'm from. That's where my parents are from. And he must have told his parents. And all of a sudden I'm at his parents' house having dinner with his parents. They like invited us to dinner.
Yeah. And it's true. We had to postpone the trip again. I have this whole thing planned where we're supposed to go, and it's like so depressing. And because I didn't know through my paternal grandmother that I had family in Italy. I never know. Nobody ever spoke about it. And I was 10 when my grandmother died, and I never thought to ask back then about any of this stuff.
Right.
But when I started finding them on Facebook and talking to them, and we started making the connections, it's just amazing. And to your point, they are so thrilled. And the one cousin that I found, she put out a group on Facebook thinking she was going to find uh, people in Spain with the same last name, Piramalo, which is a very uncommon name in Italy. In fact, it's just that one family. Uh, and maybe South America. She'd never had a clue that she would find somebody in America. And in fact, there were only two people that came to America, my grandmother and her aunt, the only
Okay.
two from that family that came to America. So they had no idea. And once we connected, it was just amazing. And, putting the pieces of the puzzle together on how we were connected and who her great grandparents were and who mine, and then, finally finding out that we all descend from the same place. And in fact, we descend from two of the same families. So we're cousins from two different families going back about, 4 generations or something like that. And so it's really something to find that out. So we went once like 25 years ago, but I didn't know any of this now. So I'm
Right.
dying to go back and find it,
Yes, I know.
and to be these places.
Right. I wanted to go back as well. My great grandfather, it seems to be all the sisters that always go missing. But on my father's side, he was one of 9, my great grandfather. So 3 stayed in Italy, 3 came to the United States, and 3 went to South America, is what the story was.
Mhm.
So I have yet to kind of delve into South American records. But I do know from some groups that I'm on Facebook that the last name is in South America. Zichinchi is in South America. So, but that would lead me to believe that a male went and not a female. So I'm not really sure, you know, how well the stories, will drive out, but we'll see. And then, and then the first time I went over, then I found out the woman in the, little town hall, she's like, well, you're a citizen. Why don't we have your paperwork? You should be applying for citizen. You're a dual citizen. I'm like, I am. And she's like, yes. I didn't even know that was a possibility until I went over there. And so then when I came back, a lot of the records that I had were photocopies or something that someone had emailed me. And so then I had to get like all the official documents. So then that was like a process to go through and get all the documents and the seals and translate them. And so I was probably one of the last people that went into New York right before COVID hit. I think I went in like on February 29th and presented all my paperwork. And so I'm still kind of waiting to hear. I don't know how long that process is going to take. But in doing that and going back and getting all the records and having to make amendments to those records because of spelling errors or, one's Antonio, one's Anthony. But my great grandmother, she had and fortunately she was a non-line relative because I think it would have been a big problem with her that she had, her name was Rafaela. They called her nickname on like one of the censuses was Philippa. Then I don't know when she did it, but when she got married, her name on her marriage record was Mary Elizabeth. And I was like, well, where did that come from? And so my aunt, who's 96, she's like, well, she didn't like her name because nobody could say it. And, they would make fun of her at school. So she changed it to Mary Elizabeth. I was like, okay, fine. So then I don't know how it went down through the, the line, but then all of a sudden everybody's like, oh, well, she's Raquel. And I'm like, she's Rachel, I'm like, and I'm like, well, that doesn't sound right. So now I have to go tell all these family members who named their children Rachel that wasn't really her name. It was Rafaela. So
that's funny. That's real funny.
yeah.
So now, do you know what the grandparents or the great grandparents did in Italy? Do you know what their occupations were?
Yes, which was very eye-opening for myself and my husband because I have a really bad shoe addiction. And come to find out, my 2 times great grandfather was a cobbler.
There you go.
I was like, it was meant to be. Like, because I had the certificate. I was like, what does this mean? What does this mean? He was a cobbler. My husband's like, that explains it all.
I'll have to check my wife. Maybe one of her ancestors was a cobbler too. We
Yeah.
have shoes and shoes and more shoes.
Right.
On the American, now, have you researched the American side since you know they've gone back so far?
Yeah. You mean my grandmother's?
Yeah,
Their
grandmothers.
families? Oh yeah, they go back a long, long, early 1600s. Dutch in New York City. They were, very well heeled in American history. So
So that's not that. So that's interesting because my ex-wife, um, her family going back is Dutch from New York City. In fact, one of her uh, great grandfathers was the family owned Rikers Island,
oh wow, okay. Yep.
and the name was Ricken, I think. And there's also going way back, there was Lent. I don't remember all the Dutch names, but her family owned her Wright family, like the Wright brothers spelling. They owned a good chunk of farmland on Long Island too.
Right. So that I had a relative. So I'm like back on I'm like at the 22nd times great grandparents on the on the grandmother's side. I've taken them back to England. Some of them are, obviously Dutch. So, there's a gentleman, Anthony Van Sillet, who was like a pirate, I guess, and came over and married this Dutch woman in New York City. And then they weren't very keen on the Reformed Church and tithing. So by the governor of New York, he was kicked out to like Coney Island area and given a plot of land. Like, don't bother with us here. Go out there
Go
and
over there.
settle your plot of land. And so this is the most fascinating thing is that he and his wife had 4 daughters. And of those 4 daughters, they all married very well-known people in New York City. So it's kind of fascinating.
Yeah, well, my kids are adopted, and my daughter, I've traced them both back. My son's birth mother back to like the 1700s. My daughter's birth parents, both sides, I was able to trace back, and through her father, she's a direct descendant of Daniel Boone
Yes.
and a direct descendant of Captain Morgan, the pirate.
Oh, okay. Very good. I have my grandmother always used to tell me we were descended. I don't know if it was Daniel Boone, but who's the other guy?
Davy Crockett.
Davy Crockett. So one of those two, I can't remember which one it was, but I haven't figured it out yet. That we were related on her side to them. And then my other grandmother, she is descended from the Bush family. So I think somewhere along the line, back in the 60s,
I'll have to
up in Maine.
I'll have to send you Kai White's email and Facebook, because he's not a direct descendant of Davy Crockett, but he's a direct descendant of one of Davy Crockett's brothers.
Okay.
So he would know, and he's like an author, and he does all kinds of charting and stuff like that. So he would definitely know if you give him the names.
I try and keep my like ancestry account just direct descendants. I really haven't gone.
That's what I do too. It gets too crazy.
Right. And, sometimes like I find information and then I got to figure out which line I have to go back on because I, forgot about it, or I'll see something online and then I might have to go investigate it. Like, I've been into the, New York Public Library several times, and and then when I get the information and a photocopy and I want to go enter it into my ancestry, all of a sudden, I'm like, okay, which line was that on? I can't, remember. So I still haven't, I know there's lots of people who are experts at ancestry. I just kind of stick with my direct descendants, and I haven't kind of pulled in a lot of extraneous people because it would just be too much to kind of control. So
no, I do the same thing. And the other person that my daughter is, she's not a direct. Well, actually, going way back, she's also a dispenser from Princess Diana's family. So
Oh, okay.
she's like an 18th and 19th cousin of Princess Diana. Um,
Okay.
and but when I told her she's 24, she's gonna be 25. So a few years ago, when I told her that she was, her great 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 grandfather, whatever, was Daniel Boone, she said, "Who's that?"
That's an
Maybe
indictment
they
of,
don't have enough television shows about Daniel
yeah,
Boone and David Crockett anymore, so the kids don't know who they
right,
are.
right. So, there's lots of history on both sides. Even the Italian side goes back pretty far. I was kind of surprised. So, and then there's I guess when you're in Sicily, there's like a town, Erice, that sits above Trapani. And so they have a big scientific center up there, from Antonio Zichinchi, who's, I guess, a Nobel Prize winner. And, so as soon as I said, when I got there, as soon as I gave them my name, they all wanted to know if I was related to him. I'm like, no, I have no idea who he is. I, I, I could be, because, when I was younger, my grandmother would always say to me, well, if you have that name, if someone has that name, you are definitely related to them. It's a very unusual name.
Well, yeah, that's what I found out too. Like, especially on, my mother's side, the names were all pretty common. On my father's mother, Piramalo, it's just one family that has the name. No,
Right.
everybody's related that has that name. And then the other family, Cracciolo, is, like I said, goes back to 900. And there's so many branches of this family. I mean, there were three main branches, and then branches off of that, and branches off of that, and branches off of that, that it just, when I was researching them, it's like, I was getting blurry. It's like, I can't figure out who's from where and
Right.
which guys these are. But they're all over the world. They're here, they're in South America, a lot in South America,
Right. Right.
and all throughout Italy. So they just exploded all over the place. Um, and again, I had never heard that name until I found a marriage record of my uh, grandmother's father, and it said he married Amelia Cracciolo, and I called my cousin who lived with my grandmother. I said, "You ever hear that name before?" And she says, "Oh, sure, that was grandma's mother." It's like,
Right.
well, that's interesting.
Right.
And then, they didn't. I don't know about your family, but and I think you mentioned it. They didn't really talk about the past that much.
No, no,
You know,
they didn't.
uh,
And even I have a picture of, a whole bunch of people, sitting on a front porch. And so I brought it to my Aunt Carmela, and I was like, who are these people? And she's like, oh, well, this is so and so, and this is so and so. And I was like, well, who's this woman? And she's like, I don't know. She was friends with my mother. And, I was like, oh, okay. And then so I'm doing some more research and everything. And I find that my great grandfather had these two extra siblings that had come to the United States that nobody knew about. And this is on a different line of the tree, not the two that were in Italy, the two sisters that were in Italy, but these two sisters that came over. I was looking for their death certificates in Italy because that's where all his siblings died. And they had come over, but nobody knew because they were married and they had different names. So I finally found them. And so I was saying something to my aunt, and she's like, oh, that's who that woman is in that picture. I was like, well, that would be her cousin, not her friend, So it was just, and then all of a sudden, I found this woman's descendants who would be her cousins. And so, we went to meet them, and she was very excited about that. But
yeah,
there's
and
like
is
so
it
many stories to pull in, you just can't kind of
and
keep up
and
with
it and isn't it funny when you meet these people that you have that connection, that somehow there's a bond there that you
Yes.
is it it's weird, right?
Right. Yeah. And like the first time I went to Italy, I kind of stepped off the plane. I was like, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm home.
I know. I said the exact same thing. My wife said, "You love it here, don't you?" And I said, "I feel like I'm among my people." I said, I can't explain it."
Right. Right.
But everything looks so familiar in a certain way. It's hard to explain, but I mean, that's the way I felt anyway.
Right, I did as well, and they never talked about any of it. So,
No,
and everybody was a cousin. You just didn't know how they were a cousin.
yeah.
So you would hear, oh, well, that's a cousin. Oh, that's a cousin. Oh, that's a cousin. Okay, but how? How are they a cousin?
Well, yeah, and I had the cousin growing up. I had the cousins of the cousins,
Yes.
that were like cousins. Every time I
Right.
see, I think about the skit on Saturday Night Live with, who's that? That's my cousin, but hey, that's my second cousin, but I call him a first cousin.
Right.
Who's
Right.
that guy? He's nobody.
Yeah.
But we were all growing up. I mean, it didn't matter. Cousins of cousins was still, they were still family
Right.
and still like
Yeah.
cousins, and uh,
Yes. And so, and then my other, going back to the occupation, my other grandfather, he was a baker. So that kind
oh,
of
cool.
everything that I like as well. So the shoes and the baked goods.
That's neat. My mom's family they were all farmers. The men were all farmers or farmhands. The women were all seamstresses. And I was going back, through the Antonati, and finally, like 1760, I found some guy who was a forest ranger. I was like, oh, finally, somebody did something different.
Right.
It was like so amazing to find somebody that had a different occupation.
Right.
But that's the exciting thing about doing that, is that, and when you come across, a story, it's even better. The dates and names and that are fun, but when you come across the story and they're able to kind of put, you know, uh, something around it, it kind of, at least for me too, it makes you, helps you know who you are, where you came from.
Yes. Yes.
And
And
like you
I get
said, with the
excited.
shoes and the baked goods.
Excited for people that I do it for. So, I'm no professional genealogist or anything, and I don't charge people, but it's like exciting for me to help other people. And then when I find that these little nuggets to tell them, I don't know if I'm more excited or they are. I'm like, oh my God, I found this. Look at this, document or this story or whatever it is. I just like to do it. I think it's fascinating, and I think it brings a lot of meaning to people's lives.
Yeah, and I find that on the group page too, because I can't answer everything, and I'll see somebody post something with some obscure name or somebody that they're looking for, and then all of a sudden I'll see an answer and it's, oh, I know that family. It's just like out of the blue, and they
Right.
make this connection, and I feel like, wow, at least you know somebody connected through my page. That makes me feel good, even though I didn't do it. At least people are connecting their roots, so it's fun to see that kind of stuff.
Right. And I
um
belong to a lot of those pages on Facebook, and the outpouring of support. And when somebody posts a question or, is having difficulty translating something or difficulty finding something, there's always, 30, 40, 50, 60 comments. And you go to comment and you're like, oh, those 60 people before me got to it first.
yeah. Yeah, it happens to me too sometimes.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. I'm like, all right, well, it's three people already answered it, so I guess I don't have to.
Right.
Well, this has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, no
um
problem. I hope you had a few stories there that are helpful to someone.
for me, every story is a good story. And I think the more we do this kind of stuff, it spurs people on to want to find it. And I think, you know, I do this for two reasons. One is I like it. I like history. I always like history, but I also don't want, I want younger people to start recognizing that this is their history. And, there's a couple of young guys that I've met through this, and they're doing it. Uh, because I don't think we should let this get lost. We're Americans, yes, but we don't want to forget what happened over there.
Right. And I have to say, the most meaningful thing is actually going there and seeing it. And if you take these journeys to where your ancestors came from and think about the journey that they took to get here, what it took for them to get here, I can't imagine that hour ride that I took out to my great grandfather's little village, he had to walk over mountain ranges and everything to get
Yeah.
Naples, to take that boat. How daunting that must have been. And it probably was no, day trip, that was probably spread over and 2 or 3 days staying at friends or family farms or, so it gives you a greater appreciation for, the privilege that we have to be Americans was given to us by, our family members.
Yeah, yeah, and what I've been learning too is uh, that a lot of times it was the women making the trip by themselves with 2, 3, or 4 kids.
Right.
So you can just imagine what that must have been like.
And the luggage and the kids, and I can't imagine. I can't imagine.
Yeah,
It was kind of surprising, that it was that moving for me to make that journey there, and to see that, from all of the different relatives that, even my grandfather in Sicily, they had to leave Sicily. I don't think they left Palermo. They went to Palermo, and then they went to Naples, and then they came over. So that
that's
was
right.
like an, bigger journey. But it's fascinating to go back and recreate all of it, because they did not give us the information. They didn't want to talk about it. I'm sure it was painful for them.
I'm sure it was. I'm sure it was. Well, thanks again. And
Thank you,
we'll
Bob. I'll
we'll
look for you
talk
at
again.
Bradley Beach.
Yes, absolutely.